Hello and welcome. So nearly a month ago, NVIDIA announced on March 18th that it would be bringing support for DirectX ray tracing to non-RTX cards. So no longer would ray tracing be limited to those GPUs that supported it in hardware through the RT Core, as there is now a software emulation through compute shaders to make it possible on GTX 1060 all the way up to the GTX 1080 Ti, as well as that latest round of 1600 series GPUs. Well, we at DF have been preparing for this moment with great anticipation, and to discuss some of our first results with these 425.31 drivers, I'm joined by Mr. Digital Foundry himself, Richard Ledbetter. How you doing there, Rich?
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Alex. Great intro. My one was all about mocking your love of ray tracing and muzzle flash shadows. But the bottom line is that this is actually really interesting stuff, isn't it? And the results are kind of different to what we imagined, I guess.
Yeah, they require some explanation, I think, too. And there's a big part of this. Ray tracing, the reason why this is at all possible in general is because ray tracing is not just that which is done in the RT Core on Turing GPUs. There's many steps to it. And that thing which is done on the RT Cores, this basically shooting out of rays and testing for intersections, is only basically the second step. The first step is actually building up this structure on the GPU which the rays are shot through, and that has its own associated cost with it. Then you have basically shooting the rays through this built-up structure, and that's what the RT Core comes in, and that can be emulated through software. And then after that, there's a very noisy image that needs to be cleaned up, which is another step in the process and also has its own expense. So basically, depending upon what the game is doing, how much denoising it needs, what type of ray tracing it uses, the results we're going to get between GPU families, Turing versus Pascal, are going to be pretty different, and that's what our results are basically showing. Going right into the worst case scenario with Port Royal, this is using ray tracing for both shadows and reflections, and it seems to be doing it with a heavy ray amount. Basically, I think it scales linearly with resolution, the amount of rays are shot out, and it's using basically, I think, multiple rays per pixel. We don't have exact numbers on that, but here we can already see, looking at the Port Royal demo, that the difference between Pascal and Turing architectures is pretty intense. What do you say so, Rich?
Yeah, I think, there's actually two iterations of Turing here. We've got Turing with RT cores, with the 2060 and the 2080, and Turing without, with the 1660 Ti. And what's interesting is that NVIDIA reckoned that because Turing is a more advanced architecture, the 1660 Ti is broadly in line with the GTX 1080, but obviously you can see that the 1080 Ti, which is pure Pascal, is kind of ahead there. It's about 23% ahead of the 1660 Ti by my reckoning. But yeah, this is an interesting one because we're going to be presenting benchmarks within this video. The question is to what extent they are actually kind of useful and viable, because this is pure, this has been baffling us for the last day. But the bottom line is this is pure ray tracing that you're seeing here by and large, whereas games like Battlefield 5, Metro, they're hybrid renderers, right? So there's ray tracing involved in conjunction with standard, a lot of standard rasterization.
And here, that's why we see such a great divergence, basically. The thing that Turing was made for with the RT Core and some other things that we're going to come to talk about here puts it way ahead. And even in categories where we usually wouldn't expect it if we were just looking at rasterization performance. Usually we kind of put the GTX 1080 Ti next to the RTX 2080 because they have similar rasterization performance in a lot of games. But here you can see that it skyrockets ahead.
Yeah, it's in that ballpark, isn't it? And this is, obviously there was a lot of controversy at the time the 2080 launched because its rasterization performance is essentially on par with the 1080 Ti. And yet here we've got a massive leap, and the 1080 Ti can't even compete with the 2060, which by my reckoning is about 70% ahead.
Yeah, pretty big deal there. But then that's not obviously representative of games. And if you move over to a more recently released title, about 2 weeks ago now, we have Tomb Raider, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which has multiple modes of ray tracing, and it uses it for shadows, which is, I would say, generally a lighter load. And here we tested between the ultra setting, which uses ray trace shadows basically for most of the environment, excluding very, very far in the distance cascades for shadows, basically where it becomes too inefficient to use ray trace shadows. That's for the ultra setting. And on medium, it basically keeps ray trace shadows to very small point lights in very specific scenes. And looking at the benchmark here, you can see on Ultra, there's an extreme difference between the GPUs.
Yeah, so by my reckoning, the 2080 is 31% ahead of the 1080 Ti, which is nowhere near as pronounced as the pure ray tracing metric we got from 3D Mark, Port Royale. So yeah, I mean, this is an example of the RT core doing a significantly lighter workload than straight out complete ray tracing.
Yeah, you also have a bit of the result being confounded by the fact that the third part of the benchmark is kind of staring over across this valley, and you can see that the FPS between the RTX 2080 and 1080 Ti kind of level out because there's very little ray tracing in that initial scene. And then when it gets down below, as the camera zooms in and looks at this village, you can actually see the difference as the RT core kicks in and a couple of the other Turing enhancements, where it can be up to, I think, 140% faster on the RTX 2080 in that one section.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big difference when it comes to RT being there. But otherwise, it's like on medium, you can see here, it's a rare case where we actually see the GTX 1080 Ti beating the RTX 2060. With it being basically 33% faster, 32% faster on average.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is, first of all, if you do just talk about average frame rates, you're not seeing the whole story because, as you say, what is more important? The bit of the scene where the RT core isn't being used, which is skewing the results of the Pascal and the non-RT 1660 Ti upwards, but then when you enter an RT scene, which is pretty heavy, the other cards kind of tank, and you really need an RTX card to get a playable frame rate. It's absolutely bizarre. But the medium setting is an interesting example of how the developer Nixxes, in combination with NVIDIA, has tried to this is kind of like hybrid shadow rendering, really, isn't it? It's kind of like augmenting traditional shadow maps rather than replacing them.
Yeah, and if you were to think about it, if we're doing these benchmarks at 1080p here, this is still actually pretty playable on the GTX 1080 Ti on medium here, I would say. Yeah. It's not that bad. Mm-hmm. I guess into the idea of how future RTX integration could work, or future ray tracing could work, where there could be maybe an ultra low setting like this that uses it sparingly and is still actually doable on cards that don't have the RT core and just do it purely through compute at that point. Obviously, this is just with the game already set to ultra and ray tracing set either to medium or ultra itself. But you can go into the game and tweak it and perhaps get a different experience as well. What was your experience there, Rich?
Yeah, so the footage you're seeing here is basically I just started the game and had a bit of a tweak with the settings to see what would happen. This is with a GTX 1080 Ti. Now, this is another example of how we're dealing with a technology here that was never meant for Pascal, that was never developed with Pascal in mind. And we're kind of stuck in this sort of dark pit here. And frame rates aren't good at all. It's like 40 frames per second. And if you turn off, and this is on medium, if you turn off the ray tracing completely, we're up to 140 frames per second. So yeah, which, isn't great. But as soon as you're out of the pit, happy days. The frame rate is actually really good. And then we move into the area that's the first part of the benchmark, except this time we're playing it and we can change things in real time. And it's really, really light. The load is, it's almost kind of negligible in a way. Mm-hmm. I say negligible, but the bottom line is we can run this at 1080p at around 80 frames per second on DXR Ultra, which is quite amazing. And it's, much, much higher still on medium. But the bottom line is that, do you really want to play a game with ray tracing enabled when it can, at any given point, bring your frame rate down by a by 66%.
Yeah.
It's kind of bizarre. And as we'll see as we go further on, benchmarks only tell us a very small part of the story.
Yeah, they don't always explain that variability that you can come across in gameplay, which we're a big fan of covering, basically making sure that you're getting, through an extended play, that you're getting more consistent frame rates. We're always curious about that. Metro is kind of an example where we see this variability of, FPS on non-Turing architecture, that you have to play more of the game and get more of an experience to actually figure out what's going on behind the scenes. Here we load up the more expensive Taiga level of the game we found through multiple videos and testing of our own, and we can see kind of off the bat that actually the GTX 1080 Ti does fairly well in this opening scene here. Which we didn't necessarily actually even expect. Here we're seeing, in the mid 40s FPS, bouncing around a bit, but that's still, we're under the presumption that global illumination would be actually the worst case scenario for Pascal GPUs, which it almost kind of is after you went into the game and started tweaking it.
Yeah, so if we look at the benchmark first of all, this is another example where the benchmark, you think to yourself, why do I need an RTX card? My GTX 1080 Ti is only about 15% slower than an RTX 2060. And in the past, we've run this game quite nicely on high settings with high DXR 1080p 60. You think, wow, I could get something with a bit more tweaking that's pretty much the same on my 1080 Ti. So we've got a benchmark here, which you think, wow, this is pretty good. But as I said, the RTX 2060, we can do 1080p 60 on that. But what I found when I actually moved out of the benchmark area, when I went into more dynamic gameplay, frame rate was just all over the place. So if we look at this bit of gameplay here, I was desperately trying to tweak to get the 1080 Ti to lock to 1080p 60 on the same settings that I used on the 2060. It just wouldn't have it. It was, so what, John basically said to me, well, look, if you can play this at console settings, 1080p 30, with ray tracing, I still think that would be a pretty good experience. So I gave that a go as well. And by and large, there are some dips, but by and large, it kind of works fairly okay for that. But the bottom line is that we are capping at half the speed of what I achieved on the 2060, and we're still dropping frames.
Yeah, and basic gameplay as well. And this is using high settings at that point with no tessellation on, no apex particles, no hairworks, 30 FPS, still dropping frames. And then there's this curious scenario where you actually enter back into the train where there's a bunch of skinned animated characters moving around. And I think this shows an architectural difference that is very intriguing. The FPS here on the GTX 1080 Ti using these settings drops into the mid-20s basically whenever you're around these characters. And we don't think that there's really a big difference in the scene here, but from what we know from watching their presentations and talking with 4A Games, that the game uses basically asynchronous compute to build this acceleration structure, which is then ray traced through. And they basically, on Turing cards, they can hide its cost rather often by having the compute be done asynchronously. Pascal has a more limited form of asynchronous compute, where it can't spread across the workload inside one SM core, but it has to do it kind of dynamically across all SM cores at the same time. And that makes it basically have less, efficient utilization. And in a scene like this, where there's very complex skinned characters moving around, it tanks the frame rate, actually. And I don't know, actually, how possible it is in general, given this variability, to even say that the entire game could be done in 1080p 30 on a GTX 1080 Ti. Because there's definitely scenes where there's lots of moving characters going around.
Yeah, and the bottom line is, would you have that global illumination and basically decimate your performance level? Because this game runs pretty well on a GTX 1080 Ti when you're not using RT.
Yeah.
So we're kind of moving into an area here where the Pascal implementation of DXR is kind of just something that you're likely to experiment with. And if you're impressed with the effects, you think to yourself, wow, this is going to be so much faster if I bought a 2060 or a 2080 or a 2080 Ti.
Yeah, precisely.
And I think that's maybe why it's there. But Yeah, it's just been a fascinating exercise here because I do, if a game doesn't have a canned benchmark that really stresses ray tracing, Metro does, I think, but it just keeps crashing on us, so we had to kind of come up with our own one. But the bottom line is that, yeah, I think you're going to be seeing a lot of benchmarks out there in-game, taken from gameplay, where you think to yourself, yeah, I'm going to give this a go, it should be pretty good. And what the actual reality, once you start playing and not benching, it's going to be something completely different.
Yeah, and we kind of figured that out in a roundabout way when going over to Battlefield 5, actually. We kind of had in our mind of going through the very expensive Provence level that we've used before and, kind of creating settings for the RTX 2060 to get that game up to 1080p 60 with ray tracing on. And we were initially doing this benchmark where we're going through, running through the level, and we're kind of seeing performance with RTX set to Ultra, 1080p, all the other settings set to Ultra that actually were very flattering, I would say, for the GTX 1080 Ti. And it was only really when we got into playing the game that we saw differences.
Yeah, so if you look at the completely pointless benchmark that we did, it displays the remarkable result that the 2060 is less than 8% faster than the 1080 Ti, and it is in this entirely scripted sequence. And I thought to myself, this is pretty awesome. So I, thought to myself, I'm going to try and just play some Battlefield 5 with the 1080 Ti and see where we go. And it was, being polite, suboptimal, I think would be the best description.
Would be the greatest description.
Yeah, but it is playable, and there are, by and large, put DXR to medium, everything else on ultra, and a lot of the time you can lock to 60 frames per second just like you can on the 2060. So why was I having these problems? And then you just basically came up with your puddle of doom hypothesis.
Yeah, there's basically, depending upon how large the reflection is on the screen itself and how many there are on the screen, the cost of ray tracing on Pascal will skyrocket, as we kind of figured out. And also, what is being reflected? If there are transparent surfaces within the reflection, like leaves, smoke, particles, basically things you would actually find on a lot of multiplayer levels with, Battlefield's a big explosive game. The variability in FPS just grows extremely. You could be at 60 at 1 second and then be down into the 30s or so just by staring directly into a reflection. That's something you don't get. That variability is something you don't get on Turing, even on the RTX 2060, which is, obviously the lowest end RTX card that is out there.
Yeah.
I also gave the game, I guess for giggles at this point in time, a try at the GTX 1060, and I immediately loaded up this benchmark sequence we had, and I was getting frame rates at 1080p, RT set to Ultra, everything else set to Ultra that were basically in the teens and the 20s, not at all anywhere near playable at 1080p. And then going through the game and kind of tweaking performance, I was able to kind of get it to near 30 FPS at DXR low, with all the other settings kind of either at ultra or high, which didn't actually have that much of a difference on performance.
What about the resolution?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I loaded up multiplayer, wanted to give it a test to see if I could bring it really up to 60. And on the expensive Rotterdam map, I had to play at basically around 66% of 1080p, near 60 FPS, and it's not completely consistent with DXR set to low.
Right, and that's at 720p, 66% of 1080p.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not at all what you'd be wishing for. And then I went back to the Provence level, looked at that puddle of doom again, and saw the frame rate in the 30s. And basically, it's an exercise of frustration at that point. I don't think middle range Pascal cards can actually offer a completely consistent performance because there's just too much variability of content, what could possibly happen, what type of reflections could even occur. A 1080 Ti has enough buffer, I would say, of headroom to kind of let it work at 1080p.
Yeah. I think the other thing to point out as well, the Puddle of Doom did actually cause some small issues for the 2060 at 1080p 60.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit. It's nowhere near as bad as it was on the GTX 1080 Ti. But I think the other thing we keep doing 2060 versus 1080 Ti comparisons. The 2060 is like a $350 card, which is considerably cheaper than a 1080 Ti was. and you're right, the 2080 is the kind of closer fit to the 1080 Ti.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Even when we're using our useless benchmarks, it's still way, way, way ahead. I think possibly this is another reason NVIDIA wanted to release the driver for Pascal, because in terms of rasterization performance, we've been comparing 2080 to 1080 Ti, and some games are faster, some games are slower.
Yeah.
You just don't see what it can actually do unless you allow the 1080 Ti to actually run the same content.
And as soon as it is, we see differences like we kind of see in Metro here, where an RTX 2080 is basically 80% faster on average and doesn't have this variability to where you can play above 60 FPS for most of the game easily at 1080p and reaching up into 1440 at this point. That's quite the difference, and it does bring kind of the discussion back down to, I guess I would say, how much of a generational difference there is between Pascal and Turing. The RT Core is not being used often enough, I would say, in enough games to make that generational difference visible. And as soon as we can now, we can actually see, wow, there's some pretty big differences between cards that are otherwise we put right next to each other.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Port Royale benchmark in particular, it kind of shows what I suspect is something close to the maximum extent of the performance increase offered by that hardware acceleration. But I still think that, I've got a big sort of issue with benchmarks in general, and gameplay benchmarks in particular. I just think that it's not the average that we should be looking at here. We're going to have to actually search out, as we did with Battlefield, a high intensity workload, that is indicative of a worst case scenario almost.
Yeah. To basically get the sense across of how stable your FPS will be in game when you actually use the product for yourself. And that's the thing, we don't see that with Pascal here. We see it being overly variable in comparison to Turing. Mm-hmm. Any final words on ray tracing on the Pascal GPUs there, Richard? Is this some sort of gimmick to get people to buy Turing GPUs in the near future? Or maybe to actually help out developers develop lower-end modes for ray tracing?
I think that it's a really interesting release. I think there is some, I think you called it in the past, cynical motive in that it will, the idea is that, hey, this is tanking my frame rate on my Pascal card, I'm going to buy a Turing and everything's going to be awesome. Yes, that could potentially be it. But another point you raised the other day, actually, which I thought was quite insightful, was that assuming there's no dedicated real-time ray tracing hardware in the next-gen consoles, it's going to be those ultra-low-cost ray tracing techniques that we will actually see. Yeah. So the opportunity to have that kind of proving ground on the PC could be quite valuable. The second point I'd like to raise is the fact that surely at some point AMD will be releasing a driver for Radeon cards that will allow for DXR to run there. I mean, why not? I mean, they're pretty compute heavy, the Radeon cards, so could get a good result there. And NVIDIA just may be moving ahead of the curve, moving ahead of the inevitability that ray tracing will run on any sort of mid to upper end GPU, regardless of whether it's got hardware acceleration or not.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. Those kind of 3 points. The cynical one of making people wanting to buy a new GPU by testing this out. The second one of kind of we get a taste of what next gen can be. We see these lower end implementations of ray tracing where it's used very sparingly, like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider on Medium here, where it is basically doable, I would argue. And I hope we get to see more of that. And then also the fact that AMD itself will be soon, hopefully, releasing support, I would hope, on its GCN architecture. And I imagine it could actually be better than Pascal in some scenarios, given the use of asynchronous compute in ray tracing itself, how it is extensively used on Turing, and I would hope it fares really well. We'll have to wait and see for that, though. But in the meantime, thank you, Richard, for joining me for this conversation, and also for taking the time to basically arrange a lot of this benchmarking here.
Yeah, it's been fun, and just a shame that I didn't have any of my quips. I wasn't able to use any of my quips on you. I've stored up a whole bunch of them, but maybe in a future video. This topic was just too important for levity.
Yeah. We can save the personal insults for later, basically. But thank you, Rich, and also thank you for watching this video. I hope you feel more informed about how ray tracing is on Pascal. Pretty variable, but an insight into the future of what we can expect. And in the meantime, though, if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. And if you want to talk about ray tracing on Pascal, or maybe even if it's on GCN someday, write a comment below or follow myself and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Richard and Alex bidding you farewell. Und
I'm not saying that, Alex.